Are people born evil? It's a question that's haunted philosophers for centuries. Aristotle believed morality is learned, and Freud thought that we were born as blank slates. But then you hear about someone like Albert Fish, and the question gets much more complicated and a lot darker. Albert Fish went by many names: the Gray Man, the Brooklyn Vampire, and the Boogeyman. And while his appearance was soft-spoken and ordinary, his crimes were anything but. This is a man who claimed to have harmed children in nearly every US state. So how does a person become a monster? Is it biology? Is it trauma? Or is it both? Hi everyone, and welcome to the channel. I'm Ray Review, and I tell a lot of dark true crime stories. So viewer discretion is advised, especially with this story because it touches on some really sensitive subjects. If you're like me and you're drawn to the darker side of humanity, and you like spoken true crime stories, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps out tremendously. And if you're hungry for deeper dives, behind the scenes access, and want early access to videos, or you just want to support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon because I have you covered there. So without further ado, let's dive into the life and crimes of Albert Fish. Albert Fish was born on May 19th, 1870, and he was born into a storm of instability, both genetic and environmental. His father was 75 when he was born, and he was 43 years older than his mother. And his family had a long history of mental illness. His uncle had mania, his brother was institutionalized, and a half-brother had schizophrenia. So when Albert Fish was 5 years old, his father has a heart attack and passes away. So his mother couldn't or wouldn't care for him. And if Albert Fish was ever a child with hope, with softness or light, that was erased in the years to come. So since his mother was unable/unwilling to care for him, she submitted him to St. John's Orphanage when Albert Fish was 5 years old. And Albert Fish described his time in the orphanage as basically torture. That what happened to him there wasn't discipline, it wasn't correction, it was cruelty masquerading as authority. The former students of this orphanage described an environment of relentless punishment at the hands of the teachers. They said that children were stripped and beaten, their clothing was shredded, and their pain was turned into like a public spectacle. Albert Fish claimed that the beatings were daily, and eventually he said that he stopped fearing the pain and actually started to like it. Somewhere along the way, pain and pleasure for Albert Fish became the same thing. Albert Fish said that one day he saw blood dripping from his own wounds and he felt a strange comfort. And that's not just trauma, that's trauma metastasizing into something unrecognizable. Researchers say that what Albert Fish experienced during his time in the orphanage was a form of shame punishment, where the goal isn't just physical pain, it's actually psychological dominance. And it's also recognized as the kind of environment as early stage conditioning for this tendencies, but today we're going to refer to it as SM here during this story. So, social media and such. The question we need to ask is what happens when a child begins to crave the thing that's destroying them? So you can imagine the kind of psychological head that's happening to a child when they're starting to identify their suffering as like part of their identity, and they start to crave something that's really tearing them down. It's the perfect breeding ground to give birth to a monster, one trauma at a time. Albert Fish was 10 years old by the time he left the orphanage, having spent 5 years there. And he wasn't just desensitized, he was pretty altered. Where most children learn empathy and safety, he learned control and submission. The cycle of violence became pleasurable, and once you associate pain with affection, you begin to seek the pain as connection. And in a twisted way, I believe Albert Fish may have been trying to create the only love he ever knew. And this is where the story turns, though, from victim to something else entirely. Albert Fish didn't grow up to become a person who avoided pain. He became someone who chased it. When Albert Fish was finally removed from St. John's Orphanage at the age of 10, it should have marked the end of his suffering, but instead it marked the beginning of his descent. His mother had secured a modest government job and could now bring him home. But by then, Albert Fish wasn't the same person. Something inside him had calcified. Albert Fish wet the bed until he was 11. He ran away from home constantly, and he was prone to blackouts and dizzy spells after a fall from a tree left him with lingering brain damage. Side note, that head trauma, childhood mistreatment, and abandonment is the kind of psychological cocktail that a lot of forensic psychologists call murderer's soup. But it wasn't just what was done to Albert Fish, it was what he started doing to other people. So when Albert Fish was 12 years old, he began a relationship with another boy, a telegraph messenger, who introduced him to some really unsavory habits. They're the kind of behaviors so extreme and taboo that even now, over a century later, I have a hard time saying them plainly on social media. But I will tell you that whatever was found in a toilet, he started eating it, consuming it. And just know this, that all of the things he was introduced to weren't just curiosities, they were rituals of humiliation, degradation, and defilement. It was also during this time that Albert Fish started stalking public bathhouses, not for companionship, but to watch other boys. And he wasn't just looking, he was fixated, like compulsively returning and lurking in the shadows. Albert Fish also started writing graphic letters unprompted to people, just to terrorize people. He'd usually do it to women he found in classified ads or matrimonial services. Letters so disturbing that even trained investigators would later call them evidence of profound psychological rupture. So, by 1880, Albert Fish moved to New York City. He is 20 years old, he is a blank face in the crowd, ordinary in every way, and yet his innards are rotting, metaphorically speaking. In 1898, his mother arranged a marriage between him and a woman 9 years his junior. She was just 17, and they had 6 children together. And for a while, it seemed like he was settling into a somewhat normal life. He was a husband, a father, and a provider. While he changed diapers and tucked his kids into bed and kissed his wife goodnight, he began to self-injure. He would beat himself with a nail-studded paddle. He'd insert needles into his own pelvis. He would light himself on fire. He claimed he was never violent towards his children, and maybe that's true, but he did involve them in rituals. Like, he would ask them to paddle him like it was a game. In 1917, after nearly 20 years of marriage, Albert Fish's wife left him for a handyman, and she took almost everything, leaving Albert Fish with just his children and his inner demons. And that's when he kind of snapped. He began hallucinating. He would wander around the house in fits of delusion, claiming that, like John the Apostle told him to wrap himself up in a carpet, he was alone, unmedicated, and spiraling. So in the early 1900s, missing children, especially from working class or marginalized families, started going missing and didn't make headlines. There was no national database, there were no Amber Alerts, and there was no psychological profiling at the time. Sometimes kids went missing, and unless they were from wealthy families, society barely blinked an eye. And that systemic failure gave Albert Fish a lot of space to operate, to move freely, and to act again and again without interruption. Albert Fish designed a pretty scientific method of preying upon children, mostly under the age of 6. One that combined patience, charm, and calculated cruelty. He would answer classified ads from young men looking for work. He'd pose as an employer or a gentleman or a savior, and if they had younger siblings, even better. Sometimes he'd offer babysitting services, and other times he'd pretend to help pick flowers or to carry groceries. He didn't just snatch people off the street. He would groom trust, slowly and purposefully, and then he shattered it. He said that he preferred victims from often marginalized communities, like children with disabilities, children of color, or children from poverty-stricken families. Because in his mind, and tragically and unfortunately, in societies at the time, those were the kids he considered wouldn't be missed. Albert Fish kept with him a collection of tools that he referred to as implements of hell, which were a butcher knife, a small handsaw, and a meat cleaver. And these were all instruments of suffering, tools for control. He wasn't trying to make people's suffering quick. He was trying to make the whole experience his own. Investigators would later uncover evidence of elaborate rituals, like staged settings, carefully selected locations, and chillingly detailed preparations. And despite what you might think, it's not always the worst people who do the worst things. It's the ones that keep getting away with it. Albert Fish wasn't just evil, he was emboldened. Every time he slipped under the radar, and every time society looked the other way, every time someone mistook his politeness for safety, it confirmed that in his mind, he could just keep going because no one was watching and nobody cared in his mind. And the truth is that unchecked behavior doesn't just continue, it escalates. And when there's no consequence, there's no reason to stop. And in Albert Fish's case, decades of slipping through the cracks didn't just enable his cruelty, it sharpened it. Which brings us to a crime that still haunts American criminal history. This brings us to the murder of Grace Budd. Some stories in true crime are really disturbing, some infuriate us, and then there are stories like this one that leave a scar. Because we're talking about the crime that Albert Fish committed against Grace Budd, and it's still one of the most depraved acts in criminal history. Grace Budd was a 10-year-old child. She liked to skip, she wore ribbons, and she maybe believed in fairies. And the last thing she ever saw was a man her parents told her that she could trust. I also want to say that Grace Budd deserves more than a footnote in Albert Fish's story. She was the reason he was finally caught, and the reason that the world saw who he truly was, and the reason that we should continue to tell this story truthfully, carefully, and with reverence. So, on May 25th, 1928. Albert Fish is now nearly 60 years old, and he was flipping through the classified ads when he saw an ad. It said, "Young man, 18, wishes position in the country. Signed, Edward Budd." To most people, that's just a request for work, but to Albert Fish, he saw it as an opportunity. Albert Fish crafted a fake identity. He called himself Frank Howard, and he was a benevolent farmer. Albert Fish put on his best suit, he polished his shoes, and practiced his polite old man smile. Albert Fish shows up to Edward Budd's house, and he claims initially that he wanted to hire Edward for some work. Then he saw Edward Budd's younger sister, 10-year-old Grace, and everything changed. He hadn't planned to take her, but real evil doesn't need a plan, it just needs an opening. He told Grace's parents that his niece was having a birthday party that day, and he said Grace would love it. There were games and cake and a lot of other kids to play with her age. And her parents believed him. He was frail, he was well-spoken and courteous, and he gave them no reason to fear him. And so they dressed Grace in her best outfit and handed her off to Albert Fish. And that was the last time they ever saw her alive. So Albert Fish did not take Grace to a party. Instead, he took her to a boarded-up house in East Irvington, New York. And it was a house he had scoped out weeks earlier. It had no furniture, no neighbors, and no escape. Grace followed him in, likely unaware about what was about to happen, and she probably thought she'd be going home soon. And what happened next is nearly unspeakable. In that house, Albert Fish strangled Grace, then he decapitated her, and then over the next 9 days, he consumed parts of her body. So how was Albert Fish caught? He had been doing things like this to children for years, practically his whole life. and he had this down to an art and science. Remember how I said earlier that Albert Fish was obsessed with sending harassment letters to people? Well, that was the smoking gun in this case. So in November of 1934, 6 years after Grace Budd had vanished, her family received a letter. It was unsigned, the envelope was plain, but the contents were unlike anything they'd ever seen in a missing persons case. Grace's mother, Delia Budd, was illiterate, so she asked her son Edward to read the letter out loud to her. The letter described exactly how Albert Fish lured Grace away from her family, what he did to her, and in chillingly clinical language. So the letter he sent, it has been released to the public. I'll go over it a little bit, but content warning, I'm just going to paraphrase it, and it's widely regarded as one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in criminal history. The language has been softened to respect platform guidelines. I believe that the emotional and ethical impact remains very real. So the letter begins with like an anecdote. He recalls a story from his childhood about a boy who went missing who was never found. He describes how a friend had invited him to stay at a farmhouse where a child was being held. The story is vague and dreamlike, most likely untrue, but he uses it to transition into what he did to Grace Budd. And it's important to note that Albert Fish never refers to Grace as a child. He totally dehumanizes her in the letter to kind of erase her identity. He recounts how he meets Grace, how she was cheerful and how she trusted him. He tells her mother that he didn't take Grace because of anything Grace did. He said it was simply her time, and her life was some fated offering to his inner demons. In his words, Grace didn't suffer for long. He claims it was quick, painless, and merciful. He calmly describes how he prepared a meal, not just what he did, but how it tasted, how he cooked it, and how many days it lasted. He ends up by telling her mother not to worry, that he did not harm Grace in that way, which is referring to SA. But you know, Albert Fish didn't send this letter out of guilt. He just wanted to re-experience the control and the thrill that he got, the fear and the fantasy. Like, it wasn't just a confession, it was a performance. And you know, it's easy to focus on the horror of it all. What Albert Fish did to Grace Budd is still considered one of the most depraved things in modern criminal history. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a premeditated, orchestrated, and executed with precision. But this letter isn't just about Albert Fish. It's about a family who trusted someone and had their trust violated in the worst way imaginable. This crime and this letter exposed how evil can manipulate kindness, how monsters don't always look like monsters, and how trust can be weaponized against the innocent. So when the truth came out, when this letter was discovered, seasoned detectives vomited. Reporters and the media refused to print large portions of the letter, and even today, some of the parts are so graphic that they're rarely discussed outside of forensic circles. It is available online, you can Google it, but I want to warn you, it's vile and it's horrible. But if you want to do an even deeper dive, it is available there. But this letter caused entire communities to grieve a child they had never met. Fortunately, the paper that Albert Fish used had a small emblem on it, and it belonged to the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. Investigators tracked the stationery to a janitor who had taken scraps home and left them at his boarding house. The trail led straight to Albert Fish's rooming house, but he'd already moved out. So Detective William King, the lead investigator, did something bold. He waited outside Albert Fish's room, waiting for him to return. And eventually, he did. So when the detective approached him, Albert Fish agreed to come in for questioning, until he suddenly pulled a razor blade out of his coat. The detective was able to disarm him, and just like that, one of the most sadistic criminals in American history was caught. So Albert Fish didn't deny anything. In fact, he actually seemed relieved to talk, like he'd been wanting to tell someone. And after decades of hiding in plain sight, behind all of the politeness and the poverty and the powerlessness, Albert Fish was finally unmasked. And what the world saw wasn't just a man, it was a study in evil. Albert Fish's trial for the murder of Grace Budd began in March of 1935, and the public was both horrified and obsessed. He was charged with first-degree murder, but this trial wasn't just about guilt, it was about sanity. They were trying to argue, was Albert Fish criminally insane? Was he a man who couldn't tell right from wrong? Or was he something far more terrifying? Someone who knew and chose to do terrible things anyway. The courtroom became a stage for some of the most disturbing testimony ever. Doctors presented detailed self-harm rituals. Psychiatrists spoke about all of his hallucinations and his obsession with biblical punishment. And the x-rays of the 29 needles in his pelvis were introduced as evidence. Albert Fish claimed he was commanded by God to commit his crimes. He said he was like Abraham, offering sacrifice. But the jury was not convinced. After 10 days, the jury reached a verdict. Albert Fish was sane and guilty. The judge sentenced him to death by electric chair. What did Albert Fish say? He seemed to be into it. When reporters asked how he felt, Albert Fish said, "It would be the supreme thrill, the only one I haven't tried." On January 16th, 1936. At Sing Sing prison, Albert Fish was led to the electric chair. He didn't cry, he didn't pray, he didn't flinch. Witnesses say he walked to the chair like a man walking to a park bench. According to prison lore, the execution was so intense that the first jolt short-circuited due to all of the needles embedded in his body. Whether or not that's true, it's one of those eerie, poetic details. But minutes later, Albert Fish was pronounced dead. He was 65 years old. On paper, Albert Fish is just another serial killer. Albert Fish was a monster. That part is clear. But monsters don't come out of nowhere. They're usually shaped by pain, neglect, and by silence. In truth, he's something a little darker and a little deeper. He was a mirror at that time that forced people to ask, how many systems failed this man? And more importantly, his victims. How do you miss evil when it wears a cardigan and smiles politely? And what can happen when trauma, illness, and depravity all collide in one human being? His case permanently changed the landscape of criminal psychology. It fueled the rise of profiling. It forced the courts to reckon with the blurred lines between insanity and evil. And it made the public demand for more oversight for children in vulnerable communities. And more than Albert Fish, we should remember Grace Budd and the dozens, maybe hundreds of unnamed victims that never got justice or recognition. Grace Budd's story isn't just a horror story, it's a cautionary tale about trust and how it can be weaponized. The real legacy here is not about a man who did unimaginable and unspeakable things to people. It's about all of the systems that allowed it to happen. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. It means so much to me, and I really appreciate you holding space to listen to these stories. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon. You get early access to videos, behind the scenes access, and connect on a more personal level there. Thank you again for being part of this journey. Stay safe and stay curious, and I'll see you next time.